On your book, The Autopoiesis of Architecture, you propose that the contemporary architectural discipline is now a new style, has a new style called parametricism. And to quote from your book, parametricism is the great new style after modernism. Postmodernism and deconstructivism have been transitional episodes that ushered in this new, long wave of research and innovation. Now, can you define what you mean by style? Why do you use the term style as opposed to genre or movement or anything?
Well, it is movement as well, and the concept I could have considered as an alternative to style is the concept of paradigm. So you could talk about the new paradigm of architectural design and research, parametricism. But this time is borrowed from the sciences. And upon reflection, I realized that the discipline of architecture has its own category, which maybe has lost some of its glory and during the 20th century, but was a very important concept in the 19th century. It was still used in the 20th century, and is still used by a lot of the general public as an audience of architecture. They consider styles to be very important category to understand what's going on in architecture. So I prefer to use the concept of style. At the same time, we want to upgrade its importance within the discourse of architecture by making clear that it should not be concerned as not talking about only superficial appearances, but as something deeper, which relates to the time architecture is trying to adapt to. And that is what the history of the great epochal styles indicate. If you list them like Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque, Neoclassicism, Historicism, Modernism, you can see that these are very significant movements, paradigms, but they are usually referred to as styles. So that's why I chose to reintroduce the concept of style, although it had been compromised somewhat in the 20th century, because the modernists were ambiguous about recognizing modernism as a style, because they were fighting against historicism and eclecticism, which I think was a style, paradigm, but this particular style was about recycling older styles. So historicism expressed itself through things like Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance, Neo-Baroque, and even the mixture of these. And that brought this category somewhat into disrepute, and it was attacked by the modernists. But I think there were also voices which tried to reintroduce that concept, namely the famous book, The International Style, from the early 30s, was tied up with an exhibition of modern architecture in MoMA, New York, and was written by Philip Johnson and Russell Hitchcock. And I aligned myself with this effort at that time to understand modernism, despite its anti-style rhetoric, as a great style. And I am putting forward and arguing that parametricism, despite rhetoric to the contrary from its own participants, should be considered a style, should itself consider a style, in that important, powerful sense, which is a way of working, a set of values, a set of spatial repertoires, and a new understanding of how architecture engages with social issues.
Yes, and I'll get to that. Also in your book you often talk about form versus function.
That's right.
And I would like you to, how do you view this binary relationship between the two? How does this binary logic structure all architectural communications?
That's right. Well, I mean, again, there is, with introducing a kind of dichotomy like this, or binary set of terms, I seem to be at odds with the kind of polemic against so-called binary logics, which was a feature of postmodernist or post-structuralist philosophy. But I believe that dichotomies and binary distinctions are very important, and I'm basing myself on the work of Niklas Luhmann, the great German sociologist, who recognized that discourses, and his examples are, for instance, the political discourse, or he calls them actually communication systems, as subsystems of society, that these kind of great discourses, or what he calls function system of society, like the economy, the political system, the legal system, the system of the sciences, that each of these have their own binary logic, which means they're based on a lead distinction around which the discourse evolves. And I found it very convincing the way he did it for these other domains of society, and I applied that thinking to the discipline of architecture. And I think the distinction between form and function as a lead distinction of the discipline, it makes a lot of sense. It's actually can be verified if we go through the history of architectural theory from the Renaissance to today, that the concern with that relationship of form and function has been perennial, and to some extent the discipline is founded when we no longer accept what I call uncritically assumed or taken for granted form-function unities. For instance, when we say something like villa, and we have a form, a spatial construct in mind, which comes naturally together with a certain social life process as a kind of undifferentiated fusion of form-function. We have the villa, we have the church, and then we have a certain form in mind, a basilica type, a certain spatial structure and a social purpose wedded together in unison. This is the pre-architectural conception of the built environment, where we have these taken for granted unities, form-function fusions. And the discipline starts, I think, when these fusions are problematized, when we distinguish form and function and question whether this form should be applied to that function. That means we no longer have these fused categories, but we dissociate form and function and problematize their relationship. And that means we start to innovate and we start to design. Because on the one hand we have, for instance, an entity like the family, and now we ask the question, what spatial shape should these residences, let's say, a more abstract term, take? And then we are in the game of relating form to function. That's the founding moment of architecture. And prior to this, there's a kind of, I would call it tradition-bound building, which is kind of mimetic of what has always been, and it's the taking for granted of essential unities, villa, church, palace, where form and function are never dissociated in question. So that's the lead distinction of the design disciplines. Because the same applies not only to architecture, it applies to urban design, to interior design, to furniture design, but industrial design, graphic design. There's always that problem of correlating or relating form to function. Usually we have clients and briefs which give some kind of description of a function to be, a social function, and then our task would be to bring formal repertoires to bear to instantiate or these and bring these functional descriptions to life within a spatial construct.
Yes, and since you mentioned it, you define architecture as a set of communication systems serving society. Now, how do you see the notion of culture in relation to architecture?
Okay. Before I get to that, I just wanted to give other examples of these kind of lead distinctions. So, if in architecture said it's form versus function, that distinction is the founding moment of architecture as a discourse and design discipline. For instance, for the sciences, it's a distinction of theory and evidence. There's always that tension, or you construct a theory to explain evidence, or you find evidence to verify the theory. Before that, you had just unities of stories where there's never a question of evidence. There was this kind of unquestioned, taken for granted, a set of truth, and that in the modern era you have these functional systems founded on distinctions, on problems, theory and evidence in the sciences, form and functions in architecture, and in the legal system, for instance, it's the distinctions of norms versus facts. So you confront the facts of an event with the legal norms it has violated or not violated, and you confront again. You operate with the kind of lead distinction, which all legal arguments and talk and discourse presupposes that distinction of norms versus fact, because that's what it's all about. And so this is, I want to just rehearse that, the way the form-function lead distinction parallels other lead distinctions which structure these discourses, and it also demarcates the discourse against the others. So these lead distinctions order the totality of human discourses or societal discourses, because they're, if you are talking about the built environment with respect to the problem of form relating to function, you talk it differently as when you talk about it in terms of norms versus facts, and you could discuss the legal aspects of the built environment, or you could discuss questions of truth and with respect to theory and evidence. And again, these are different ways of talking, for instance, about the built environment, and they distinguish the architectural talk from the scientific talk, from the legal talk, or a political talk, which again yet has another founding distinction. So I just wanted to elaborate that. Now, you asked me about the question of culture, and the first thing I want to point out is that I agree with Luhmann that we're living in a world society, which implies global discourses. So architecture is now world architecture. The discourse we embedded in as architects in the 21st century is global and part of contemporary world culture. That's where I would like to talk about this. It gives you a drift, and not only is there world architecture, there is world cinema, there is world politics, there's a world economy where these systems are integrated. Right? If you act economically in this world, if you choose a job either in London or New York or Beijing and Hong Kong, and various companies based there compete with each other for employees, but they also compete for projects. They have to employ state-of-the-art technology, and they have a knowledge base, which is, all this is global. The same applies to all other aspects. The art world is global. Art circus and art world. We have a series of arenas like Frieze in London or Hong Kong Art Fair or Art Basel. These are global events. So that's our culture. So to some extent, when we're now asked to whether architecture should be culturally specific, then the first thing is, yes, it needs to be of our time. It needs to be fitting within global contemporary 21st century culture. I think pragmatism does that on many levels. Further than that, what I would be critical of is the quest that architecture should relate to historical cultures. There's a certain nostalgia sometimes, and a sense that there should be something like national cultures which you should embed yourself to. I think that was the 19th century, was very much for nation states and national cultures. Still moved on. 20th century modernism already eroded that. Some people regret that, because when you go as a tourist and you're not kind of working in these cultures, you want to observe like in a museum, you want to cherish and appreciate other cultures. That's a bit like going into a zoo or going into a museum. Yes, you appreciate the preservation of these older cultures. I mean, at least the artifacts. Usually it's not the true old culture. Maybe there's a bit of a costume scenario put up for tourists. So I don't think that is 21st century architect's task to deliver that. That's a sub task. But I still recognize that there are that 20th century. So I reject in a sense national cultures, ancient historical cultures as clues for contemporary work. But I would still argue for cultural adaptation and sensitivity with respect to the various subcultures of the 21st century. So first of all, is not everybody is. There's a world division of labor. There are different cultures coexist. They're not necessarily geographically ordered. They're not nationally ordered. I think they're ordered in terms of disciplines, professions, industries. So I believe, for instance, that the world, or the art world, and artists and gallerists and that whole world has a certain cultural molds and moods. You see how you can recognize how an artist is dressed, the kind of casualness, the certain outrageousness, which is very different from the world of financiers and banking and finance business. That's another world. It's the world you find here in the city of London and you find on Wall Street. You have the world of, let's say, media professionals, film, television, movie, advertising, so the mass media. I think these are cultures. There's also differences in age groups or in professional categories, like, let's say, students of a different cast of character, and there's a student culture which is a little bit different from these other cultures I was talking about, bankers or adult professionals. They have a different internal culture than students, and these are the kind of cultures which we need to, of course, recognize, being sensitive to, and I think pragmatism can. We have the tools to do that, because we can distinguish status groups. I might refer to this later, through crowd modeling and agent-based development of the social scenarios. We can be quite sensitive and nuanced with respect to the differences in culture of these various social groups in different cities, or even obviously in one city. If you go to a big city like London, there are very different cultures. There's still a kind of working class culture. In certain parts of the East End, there is the City of London bankers and business culture. There's media culture. There's tourism, of course. There's youth tourism. There's student milieus. So all these cultures are very important, but they're no longer national cultures. So I believe that architectural students from all over the world, they share more than with each other than with other groups within their respective national cultures.
Yes, and talking about our society, this communication aspect of the post-photo society, how would you relate that to contemporary practices of education? The idea of collective teaching, international collaboration, that architecture can be learned everywhere. How do you see this in context of architectural workshops?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I'm talking about post-Fordist network society. I mean, the concept of post-Fordism became prominent in the 1980s. It was developed early in the 70s, when you start to see a society based on mechanical mass reproduction which delivered sameness with huge efficiency and led to a kind of what I call a universal consumption standard, but also to a unifying pattern of work, 9 to 5, in bureaucracies or at assembly lines. It was the great era of homogenization and also of stability of repetition. Means our lives became very stable, very routinized, reliable, and our cities looked like monotonous and repetitive and well ordered between work areas and live areas and areas of consumption. The Corbusier city of 3 million inhabitants is a kind of diagram of that condition, and that condition was valid, I would say, around for 60 years. And that has been transformed. Primarily, I think the impetus materially was the microelectronic revolution and the idea of CNC controlled production processes, robotic production which can be reprogrammed and therefore has short cycles of innovation. You can have a product diversity rather than monotony and new products all the time, which meant that research and development was accelerated, and as the factories were turning out through robotics products, it was all about researching, designing, marketing research, so that our work became much more collaborative, because you have to not just beaver away at executing a design for 10 years or 20 years. You had every year, second year, you have to develop new projects. That means you need to collaborate. These big, huge company hierarchies start to break down into networks, organizations. They had to bring in consultants of various kinds, create team configurations, teamwork, and that's been our work more and more. It's communication work in networks. We remain networked globally as professionals, not only within the company, but across companies, with consultants, with clients. And that in education also means it's no longer possible to just learn a standard set of truths or procedures which you can rely on for the next 20, 30, 40 years. We have to kind of learn on the job and relearn, and it makes no sense for students to, there is not a standard set of skills or knowledges, so it will be much more decentralized. Schools are more autonomous with respect to developing their curriculum. Within schools you have individual units, like at the AA. They're all autonomous in the creation of their curriculum. They're free to problematize and redefine what students might be working on. It's not so much learning, it becomes a form of research, a form of engagement in a very, very fluid and open field. And part of that is workshops. Workshops not only for students and for young professionals who keep themselves updated, who feel that they have to keep networking on the one hand, but also keep updating their knowledge in various workshops, because they can't rely on what they've learned. Maybe they're out of school 5 years or 10 years, and whatever they've been doing at that time is far less relevant than it would have been a generation ago when for instance, somebody in the 1950s went to architecture school and learned about modernism, about Corbusier, learned certain ways of drawing and designing with grids and isometrics and certain forms of composition. He could do that for the next 20 years without having to learn any additional tools, without learning any additional concepts, concerns, techniques, theories. For instance, somebody was studying from 1950 to 1954. In 1974, nothing had changed. In 1984, he could still work, but then it started cracking up. Now we need to think of education totally different. It's part of a lifelong networking, learning, relearning, and to some extent, the experience we gain on the job, of course, is very valuable. But the interesting thing is that it's not enough. And even the RBA and such organizations demand a continuous professional development as a recognition in the professional bodies that some kind of certificate from 20 years ago is no guarantee for professional competence.
So you see teaching and practice in architecture as binary codes towards producing innovation. What would you say that is the position of the architectural practice in relation to theory?
Okay, so this idea of research, I mean the design research laboratory at the AA, we realized that, as I described earlier, what happens in schools, particularly in master degree courses, is not just learning something, some standard set of skills and knowledges, because that doesn't exist. With the more ambitious schools in particular, the schools took up some of that advanced research, which is required, which in other disciplines maybe you have at university, you have dedicated researchers who are not necessarily teaching but simply are funded researchers. You also have in industry, for instance in chemistry, you have chemical concerns who have whole research and development departments set up doing research, not doing production, doing something which might lead or might not lead to a viable product in the long run. So in architecture, we don't have neither that kind of university-funded research very strongly, or not at all, nor do we have much research departments in architecture firms. They're simply not big enough. It's seemingly not as required. I mean, large companies start to have a little bit of that, like Foster's and Partners, trying to conduct some research, and Zadit Architects will do that too. But how does research, if there are no dedicated research institutions in the discipline, take place within architecture? And my argument has been, and my observation has been, that it's been the educational institutions, not through dedicated research workers, but with students who are supposed to learn. Their time and energy is, in a sense, diverted, because we don't know what they should learn, into developing new knowledge and new skills, and challenge the discipline and speculate about possibilities. And that has been doing at Design Research Camp. And on the other hand, we have young avant-garde companies who might not have client base yet, who don't have urgent big projects to deliver with certainty, but the young architectural firms who do competitions with little prospect perhaps of winning, but as a form of provocation, of research, of speculation, they work through exhibitions, they're partly teaching. So I think it's avant-garde architects, young, small avant-garde firms on the one hand, and avant-garde design studios at schools delivering a research which is more and more required, because, as I said, society is evolving, the construction methodologies are evolving, design techniques are expanding, so there is a lot of trial and error, of research, of speculation required to find new ways, new innovative ways to innovate. Innovation is very, very much more required and a challenge to all disciplines and professions in post-war network society, and the schools and these avant-garde firms have that role, and that's why we need to have what I call methodological tolerance. So we need to tolerate, in a sense, that some of these projects which happen in schools, they're unclear with respect to their pragmatic validity. They're not obvious with respect to their purposes. There's a sense of vagueness, of uncertainty, of speculative groping, which to some extent we need to accept. At the same time, once you have that tolerance has evolved, there's of course also the danger of students and whole units getting lost in pursuits which have little chance to become relevant. So there has to be a self-critical discourse which is trying to sort out what is valid and promising speculation and research, and what is just escapism and fanciful diversion. So that, and I've intervened in that discourse, but my starting point is to say it's a certain amount of tolerance I have to defend what's going on. That a lot of these schools of architecture, they're against say older critics or critics who think there could be something very streamlined and goal-oriented. I think these critics miss the point that there needs to be trial and error and experimentation to filter out innovations. On the other hand, we need to still keep our critical awareness of that it's not anything goes, but it is about finding ways towards innovation.
Now, I want to go back to the fact that you mentioned standardization, and I want to compare it with what you just mentioned, avant-garde. How do you see the link between the avant-garde and the mainstream? Can the avant-garde become mainstream? If so, how does this shift redefine the dynamics of the practice?
Yes, I mean, the whole point of an avant-garde is to conquer the mainstream, to replace the mainstream. The avant-garde means those who are ahead, and they're only ahead if somebody follows. So sometimes you have a kind of illusory vanguardism. Somebody, a self-declared avant-garde, who were left on their own without developing any followingship. That is, in fact, in retrospect, no avant-garde. So, and what is the striking example here is, of course, the avant-garde of the early 1920s, which gathered, for instance, at places like the Bauhaus, and the kind of creation of modernism in urbanism, architecture, interior design, industrial design, graphic design. That was a true avant-garde. Le Corbusier, if you read his writings of the early 1920s, because they became a mainstream. I mean, it took about 10, 15 years. At the end of the 20s, into the 30s, it gathered pace, and the post-war era arrived into the mainstream, and in the 60s and 70s became a global transformation. The built environment of this planet and the world of artifacts and its totality has been remade in the image of modernism according to the kind of initial vanguard thoughts and experiments of the Bauhaus. So that is a fantastic model, and that is a true avant-garde. And I think that parametricism and the movement I've been part of has been growing since the mid-90s and have gathered pace, and there's a convergence, and it starts to impact the built environment through firms like Starlight Architects, and with the same period has grown from 5 to 10 people to 450 people with many projects globally. There's a number of other firms who are operating in the same directions, and the whole generation of young architects working. It hasn't yet impacted the built environment on the scale of modernism, but that's what we should aspire to, and that's what we should strategically gear our discourse and ambitions towards. And so that means and this generalization of principles is very important. It will be less homogeneous than in the modernist era, because that's the civilization of Fordism which brings this kind of unification of results. What I'm talking about in parametrism is the unification of principles and methodologies with the huge diversity and complexity and richness of results, but under these principles. It needs to be pushed into the mainstream, because otherwise all that research effort, all these innovations which evolve really have no impact, don't fulfill their purpose. I don't believe that the purpose of my work, for sure, is not to be a kind of curiosity, a kind of one of these projects, something kind of what Goodness calls the bohemian demi-monde, a kind of world of exclusive club of insider connoisseurs. I don't believe that at all. I think that's an early stage. You create these kind of concentrated groups and clubs and movements, but the whole point is to universalize that and to spread out. That's what I'm working towards, and I know that the last 5 years, because of the world economic crisis, has slowed that and has stopped that. I mean, any development, some countries like Greece and Italy, there's nothing going on. In Spain for a few years. That doesn't mean that what we were on to will not continue once economic conditions recover.
And then when avant-garde becomes mainstream, how do you think that it views avant-garde itself?
I mean, when avant-garde becomes mainstream, it actually verifies its intuitions. And that's a tough one. I mean, as you push things into mainstreams, you confront resistances. You need to be more convincing. You don't only convince a group of initiated, you need to convince clients and wider audiences. So you need to explain the advantages, and you really have to deliver advantages. And that's then really the test, whether what you've been talking about in retrospect will be recognized as avant-garde or as some kind of false utopian aberration, which was... And a lot of people think of parametricism as something which they can dismiss as an aberration, something which doesn't lead anywhere, which is kind of... because they don't recognize the advantages, the rationality, which is embedded in that. That's been my argument. On the one hand, you develop repertoires and techniques, and you convince your peers about the beauty, elegance, complexity of what you're doing. But you need to also explain why this fits within larger societal developments, purposes, civilizatory, into contemporary civilization. And that's what I'm trying to argue in terms of articulating complexity, making complexity legible. It allows computational techniques and intelligence to be brought into the service of the design disciplines, which other styles and paradigms don't make use of. We make powerful use of. But it needs to really convince in the real world. But that means we also have to become more sophisticated. We have to explain better what's going on. We have to deliver advantages. We have to face problems of on the urban scale, problems of the environmental challenge, and we've taken on more and more of these challenges. We've been working through these issues with the principles of parametrism, and so far as I'm concerned, these principles and methodologies and values have delivered. They have shown themselves, for instance, to be very powerful with respect to addressing the ecological challenge. The ability of parametricism to adapt to specific local climates and microclimates, the way we analyze environmental data, the way we allow these data to drive facade articulations, volume articulations, passive systems. All these discourses are very well brought in and delivered. So that makes me confident that some architects worry about going mainstream means having to become superficial or having to kind of cater to uninformed audiences, and that's not the way this works for us. It's not that when we go mainstream that we revert back to old models or that we deviate from our principles. That is also not the point. The point here is to show the veracity of these principles. So if you look at the projects we realized now in the last 10 years on a larger and larger scale, they are not compromising the principles and values, and the hypothesis has been pushed through and tested and has a degree of success. That's the way we go mainstream. Of course there will be some epigons, there will be some architects and commercial firms who will pick and choose cherries and superficially make things look similar in some respects. There's a kind of watered down version of what we're doing, and that needs to be criticized, but at the same time it might be better to have a watered down version than having a kind of a pure minimalist or historicist project. So to some extent there will be an interim transitional projects. You had the same in modernism when you had the pioneers of modernism becoming projects on ever large scale, but then you had also compromise projects. You had, for instance, Art Deco. Art Deco is in a sense traditional 19th century typologies dressed up with modernist features and cliches, and to some extent that's inevitable, a part of something becoming mainstream, but we need to distinguish that from the true mainstream of parametricism which will come through, and these phenomena, for instance, you have in the 1930s you have Art Deco as a kind of superficial adaptation to modernism, but in the 50s, 60s and 70s that was gone. Then you had literally everybody within the discipline was brought up as a modernist, understood principles of modern design under the auspices of modernism, and you really have a coherent modernist built environment. And Art Deco had gone by the side, and I believe the same should happen with parametricism as it moves mainstream and will transform the totality of the built environment in its image according to the principles we project. And I don't believe that a kind of watered down KPF version, or they could name others, the KPF, SOM, etc. version of parametricism will prevail. Actually, in fact, these firms will in the end become more rigorous in the application of parametricism, because all their student intake or young professionals will drive that. And you have in fact a firm like SOM been one of the most powerful and competent and rigorous modernist firms in the 60s and 70s, for instance. So the size of the firm doesn't prevent per se a rigorous and principled pursuit of a paradigm.
And perhaps one more question. With design with parameters, okay, how would you see the next step in the discipline of architecture? Would you see a continuation? Would you see?
Yeah, I think I think the paradigm goes as long as there's some new societal challenge or new technologies on the horizon which really change the game. As long as this hasn't happened, we're still working through the microelectronic revolution, the computational revolution, and the shift of society from Fordism to post-Fordist network society. As long as this is going on, parametricism is the answer, because it has adapted itself to these conditions. Now, of course, within this broad outlook and paradigm, within this broad style, there will be, of course, continuous accelerated progress, much faster than in modernism. There will be a series of subsidiary styles. There are various ways of translating that. the different characters and firms developing different versions of that, and I expect that. And also I think we're moving, in terms of the design methodologies, we're moving very fast. For instance, when we started with just modeling 3D by hand, of course through control points, through nerve surfaces, etc., to create fluid and well-adapted organizations, we moved from there to using scripts and algorithms, because we could be more precise and more nuanced and more intricate in the articulation of complexity. We're moving from there now to the integration of engineering logics, physics engines, to bring in more constraints, yet maintaining degrees of freedom. So these are advances of the last few years, and now we're getting more and more into optimization processes within that, evolutionary algorithms, more complex setups computationally. Also, there's the agent-based systems and modeling to enhance our capacity, which have an impact on the sophistication of the outcome as well, and also on the physiognomy of the outcome. So you'll see and sense the differences. So there will be an evolution, and there will be different trajectories. Of course, this will always be more taking on more and more parameters, and giving more adaptive sensitivity and variables and degrees of freedom to an outcome, and therefore be more adaptive, more sophisticated. So it remains parameter driven, of course. That's the great conceptual leap, but it is parameter driven in much more sophisticated and nuanced ways than ever before, and so I think I see this going forward, but the kind of values of differentiation, association of things are interdependent and connect and resonate with each other, these kind of principles, and that elements are varied and context sensitive. These principles are very general and abstract. They will, I think, maintain their validity. There's no point in stepping back from that and saying, no, let's go back to kind of isolated objects. Some people talk like this, they're getting bored with something because it's been going on for 10 years, and then the kind of way of handling that is to kind of go back or go sideways. That makes no sense to me. That's very kind of facile or superficial, and I have the feeling that some of that new so-called object-oriented philosophy is misunderstood and translated in a way of the kind of resurgence of the object and of the autonomous object, rather than something which is relational and embedded in fields and making connections. I don't see that as meaningful, because our society is ever more connected and networked within its different ramifications, and we're living in a society where the correct slogan would be everything communicates with everything, and these communications intensify and ramify, and that's the way a building is very much connected and sensitive to its surrounding, because it needs to interact and connect, and the life processes need to become simultaneous and aware of each other, because you can't afford anymore to isolate yourself, because life will pass you by, and you will be unproductive, you will be provincial, you will be disconnected, and you will be irrelevant. So nobody wants that.
Yeah, true.